The iPhone 5C is one of the worst iPhones that Apple ever made. The cheap plastic construction, a year-old hardware, and a price tag that was only $100 less than the iPhone 5S it released alongside meant that the iPhone 5C was doomed to fail. And looking back, it might just be the worst iPhone Apple ever made. So here it is, this is the iPhone 5C. This is pretty well agreed upon that this is the worst phone that Apple ever made. This is the green variant. It is one of the few plastic-backed iPhones that Apple ever made. Obviously, the first couple phones that they came out with was a plastic back, but since the iPhone 4, there has not been another plastic-backed iPhone other than this one to ever be released. And so why was it the worst phone that Apple ever made? Is it a bad phone? No, it's basically just an iPhone 5 stuffed inside of this new form factor. The battery, I believe, is 5% larger, and then the front-facing selfie camera is supposed to be a minor improvement. So the specs of this phone, they really aren't that bad, especially when they came out. This was just basically a one-year-old phone in a repackaged skin, and if the price is cheap enough, then it's actually a really solid option. And that's where it falls apart, because this phone was released next to the iPhone 5S, which is one of Apple's best phones that they ever made. While the 5C was Apple's worst, it released alongside one of Apple's best, the iPhone 5S, with an aluminum back panel, an SoC, the A7, which was twice as fast as its predecessor, Touch ID, improved cameras, and a refined design from the year prior. The $649 iPhone 5S was a perfected design that added much needed features. Looking back at the stark difference between the two, it was never a fair fight. This phone was always going to be compared to the iPhone 5S, not the iPhone 5 that was preceding it, because this launched alongside the iPhone 5S, and this phone for the 16GB variant, which was the variant that everybody bought because the 8GB variant was literally just not enough. Even back then, it was just not big enough, not enough storage. It cost $549 for this phone for the 16GB variant. For the 16GB version of the iPhone 5S, it was $649. So it was $100 cheaper to buy this phone versus buying the iPhone 5S. And surprise, surprise, this phone sold well for the first couple months of its life, and then after that, everybody wanted the iPhone 5S because nobody in their right mind would buy this phone compared to the 5S for only saving $100. You're only saving like 15%. So it's really just not enough money to convince anybody to get this phone. And that's where it falls apart. Looking back, it makes sense that this phone didn't do very well. I think that if this would have came out at like a $349 price tag, that would have enticed a lot more people because this is almost half the price of the iPhone 5S. The problem is that the iPhone 5S was spectacularly better than this phone. The processor was twice as good. It had Touch ID, the cameras were better. Everything about the iPhone 5S was better, and for $100 more, you would kind of be silly to buy this one because you could get the iPhone 5 used just as an older variant for basically the same price or even cheaper. So it just didn't make a lot of sense, but this phone does have a special place in my heart. The plastic back design video was one of the first videos I ever watched of an iPhone being made because I just thought it was so cool. I loved what they did. I thought the way that Johnny Ives talked over it, and I remember to this day the blue plastic back getting hit with the water and being cut. I just thought it was the coolest thing. This is a high quality plastic shell. The green still looks really good. I think this is the best color. This and the blue were really nice looking. And honestly, a retrospective today, this actually really wasn't that bad of a phone. It was just priced so poorly compared to a different phone. So is there any use for this phone today? Well, obviously, no, not really. I couldn't get it to connect to the Wi-Fi network at my own home because it doesn't support it. I looked all over the place. I don't really understand Wi-Fi networks that much. Basically, it doesn't support the current standard of Wi-Fi. I could be wrong, but I typed in my password about 1,000 times and I know it's right because I checked it on my other phones. It just would not allow me to connect to it. But there are some things you can use this phone for. It is running 10.3.3. So it's actually a nice looking version. This iPhone came out with the iOS 7 update, which if you remember, that came out back in 2013. I remember being a freshman in college when that came out and I was so pumped to see it. I remember sitting in my dorm all day, refreshing, waiting to get the update finally, and I got it while I was at golf practice, which was so annoying, so I couldn't do it until I got home. But that was a huge update. It really changed a lot for the design, architecture, and honestly, we still see basically iOS 7. It's just been slightly updated since then. iOS 6 and before had a very unique design. iOS 7 was completely different from that regard. So what can you realistically use this phone for today? You're not going to be using it as a phone. This, at this point, is just a glorified iPod. This phone is very, very tiny, especially compared to the modern iPhones, and it's crazy. They fit this little, do you see this little black thing right there? So that's a headphone jack. I'm not sure how they were able to squeeze squeeze that in, seeing as it takes up so much space. But it is pretty remarkable how a phone so tiny could actually fit a headphone jack. It just makes you think like these new 7-inch phones that Apple's coming out with, maybe they could fit a headphone jack, but I know it's a really big port and it does take up a lot of space. So, and this phone's just not as good as a modern phone. Anyways, so it does have a headphone jack and it has a lightning connector, so it uses the modern standard. This isn't using the 30 pin. So if you were going to use this phone, the way I'm using it is as a glorified iPod. That's all it is. I have my 450 songs or whatever stored on here. I don't like paying Spotify and I don't like using Apple Music because it just costs a bunch of money. So I just like to buy my CDs and then I put them on here. I rip them and put them on here, and that's sort of how I engage with this thing. That's really all that it's good for anymore. It was an interesting phone. It came out, my brother had one, and I always thought it was cool, but it just was never as nice as the iPhone 5S, and that's the phone I ended up getting, was the 5S, because why would you get anything else? Why would you get this when you could just get the 5S for just $100 more? Thank you for watching. I will see you in the next one. This has been Scott with Techno Eclipse. And if you want to join the email list, that will be linked down below. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next one. This has been Scott with Techno Eclipse. Peace out.